Dr. Voltra arrived at work expecting disaster. The previous week had been one long demonstration of what happened when an organization attempted to function without competent supervision. Reports vanished. Meetings appeared on her schedule without supporting documentation. Equipment requisitions arrived incomplete. Several department heads proved themselves incapable of correctly filling out forms specifically designed to prevent mistakes. Voltra had spent most of the week irritated, which unfortunately was only slightly different from her normal disposition. The fact that every problem had begun at exactly the same time Rose left the office was irrelevant. Correlation was not causation. Any first-year medical student knew that. The hospital was clearly suffering from a broader administrative decline that merely happened to coincide with Rose's reassignment. The alternative explanation was ridiculous. Unfortunately, the moment Voltra stepped into her office, that explanation became significantly harder to defend. Her desk was clean. Not clean by ordinary standards. Clean by Rose standards. Reports were sorted into orderly piles. Urgent requests had already been separated from routine paperwork. Meeting schedules were attached to relevant documentation. Several forms requiring signatures had been highlighted. There wasn't a single mystery stack of paper waiting to ambush her. Voltra stood in the doorway staring at the scene with immediate suspicion. Hospitals did not become organized on their own. This level of order suggested either exceptional competence or a conspiracy. Her eyes eventually settled on Rose, who was seated at her workstation as though nothing unusual had happened.
Good morning, Domina.
Rose said quietly. Voltra narrowed her eyes and asked,
How long have you been here?
A little over an hour.
Rose replied as she poured Voltra her usual Veritruce mixed with a shot of Uthragnos. Voltra motioned to her desk.
You did all this?
Rose looked around the office innocently, as if playing at not knowing what Voltra was on about.
The paperwork?
Obviously, the paperwork.
Voltra's ears flattened as she replied. Her tail swayed behind her. Rose blinked.
Needed to be done. I did it.
Voltra frowned. It was an infuriating answer because there was nothing wrong with it. She moved toward her desk and began reviewing documents. Everything was where it belonged. Every report was organized correctly. Every request had supporting information attached. Every problem she expected to spend the morning solving had already been solved. The effect was immediate. Before she could stop herself, she relaxed. This annoyed her. The office had been functioning perfectly for less than 10 minutes, and already she felt better than she had all week. Clearly, this demonstrated the importance of competent administrative personnel. Nothing more. A surgeon performed better when unnecessary distractions were removed. That was simple efficiency. Rose's return had improved efficiency. Any emotional interpretation beyond that was nonsense. By lunchtime, Voltra had identified a second problem with her previous theory. Rose did not simply solve problems. She prevented them. The distinction became impossible to ignore once Voltra started noticing it. A department head arrived carrying an incorrect requisition form and somehow left with the correct paperwork before reaching her desk. A shipment arrived missing documentation, only for Rose to produce replacement records from somewhere. A surgeon entered, looking for patient files, and received them before finishing his question. Every inconvenience that reached Voltra represented dozens that never did. Rose intercepted them, corrected them, redirected them. Entire categories of irritation vanished before becoming visible. The realization lingered throughout the afternoon. Not because it was important, Voltra assured herself, but because it was professionally interesting. Rose had apparently been doing this for months. Voltra simply hadn't noticed because success was invisible. No one paid attention to the problems that never occurred. A functioning office attracted no attention at all. Only now, after spending a week buried beneath administrative nonsense, could she properly appreciate the scale of what Rose accomplished. The fact that she kept looking up from her work to watch Rose was unrelated. Rose was an employee, an unusually effective employee, an employee worth observing. That was all. She certainly wasn't looking because Rose seemed happier to be back. She wasn't noticing the confidence Rose had developed since her first day in the office. She wasn't paying attention to the way staff naturally gravitated toward Rose whenever they needed help. Those observations would be personal. Voltra's interest was entirely professional. Unfortunately, Rose was having a terrible day. Ever since Vexa had pointed out the obvious, every interaction with Voltra had become a problem. Before that conversation, she had been perfectly capable of pretending her feelings were manageable. Then Vexa had forced her to actually acknowledge them, and now every conversation felt dangerous. Voltra thanked her for organizing the office. Rose spent 10 minutes wondering whether the statement meant anything. Voltra asked whether she had eaten lunch. Rose spent another 10 minutes wondering whether that meant anything. The answer was obviously no. Voltra barely understood her own emotions. The idea that she was secretly sending romantic signals was absurd. That knowledge did not help. By the time lunch arrived, Rose was exhausted from repeatedly arguing with herself. So when Voltra announced they were going to get lunch at a nearby restaurant, Rose was already beside herself. The invitation itself meant nothing. Rose knew that. Voltra ate lunch there constantly. Rose accompanied her constantly. Refusing to accompany Voltra would be roughly equivalent to refusing to accompany her own shadow. The problem was that everything felt significant now. Every routine had become suspicious. Every kindness carried a hidden meaning. Rose hated it. She hated Vexa for being right. Most of all, she hated the fact that she could no longer pretend she wasn't hopelessly in love with the enormous blue disaster currently leading her through the hospital corridors. Voltra, meanwhile, was thinking about food. Specifically, she was thinking about how much she disliked restaurants. Not because the food was bad. Most restaurants near the hospital produced perfectly acceptable food. The problem was that restaurants contained people, and people had an unfortunate tendency to recognize her. The moment she pushed through the door, several employees looked up. One customer visibly straightened in their chair. Someone whispered her name. Voltra immediately regretted existing in public. Success, she reflected bitterly, was exhausting. The hostess appeared almost immediately. This was one of the reasons Voltra tolerated the establishment. Competent employees were difficult to find. The woman greeted her by name and asked whether she wanted her usual table. Voltra informed her that if the restaurant had somehow misplaced an entire table since her last visit, she would have serious concerns regarding management. The hostess laughed. Voltra did not. She never understood why people assumed statements became less true simply because they were phrased humorously. Rose followed her toward their table while trying very hard not to think about the fact that they apparently had a usual table. The restaurant itself was built primarily for chimera customers. The chairs were oversized. The tables were sturdy enough to survive accidental abuse from creatures weighing several thousand pounds. Most of the clientele consisted of professionals on lunch breaks: doctors, engineers, administrators, logistics managers, productive members of society obtaining calories before returning to productive activities. Voltra approved of this arrangement. A restaurant should facilitate eating. Everything else was a distraction. She settled into her seat and immediately picked up a menu despite ordering the same meal every visit. Across from her, Rose opened her tablet and prepared to review reports. The server arrived before either of them had spoken more than a few words. He asked whether they wanted the usual. Voltra confirmed that they did and then ordered Rose's meal without consulting her. The interaction lasted only seconds before the server departed. Rose stared after him. Then she stared at Voltra. Voltra noticed. Rose wished she hadn't. After a bit of silence, the larger woman eventually asked what was wrong. Rose hesitated before admitting she was surprised. Voltra remembered her order. The response earned her a look normally reserved for particularly disappointing paperwork. Voltra informed her that she had ordered the same meal nearly every visit for months. Remembering it required approximately the same amount of effort as remembering that gravity existed. Rose immediately wished she had kept her mouth shut. The fact that Voltra considered this entirely ordinary somehow made it worse. Their food arrived shortly afterward, allowing Voltra to return to more important matters, specifically explaining why the orthopedic department represented a continuing threat to civilized society. Rose listened while picking at her lunch. The conversation might have continued indefinitely had she not yawned. Voltra stopped speaking. Rose froze. The reaction was immediate enough that it felt like tripping an alarm. Voltra's attention shifted entirely toward determining why she looked tired. Rose attempted to dismiss the issue. Voltra ignored the attempt. The investigation continued until Rose eventually admitted she had stayed up late organizing records. The answer did not improve Voltra's mood. Rose recognized the expression immediately. It was the same expression Voltra wore whenever someone used her own arguments against her. Apparently, telling Voltra that something needed to be done was acceptable. Telling Voltra that Rose stayed awake because something needed to be done was less acceptable. Several moments later, Voltra announced that the afternoon procurement meeting was cancelled. Rose nearly dropped her fork. The meeting involved a major supplier. It was important. More importantly, Voltra knew it was important. Rose spent several minutes attempting to convince her otherwise. The effort accomplished nothing. Voltra insisted the meeting was unnecessary. Procurement was inefficient. Procurement was wasteful. Procurement would survive postponement. The fact that every one of these arguments had appeared only after Rose yawned was, according to Voltra, entirely coincidental.